Welcome, everybody, and welcome to the folks down at the Marine Laboratory to our exciting talk today with Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis. I just want to first thank you all for being accommodating of the change in the schedule and the location for this week's professional program seminar. I've already heard from several people, why aren't we in Love? And that's because this room is supposed to be bigger. So hopefully everybody can fit here. Tim and I were just saying this may be the first time we've ever had all the professional master's students in one place at one time. So that's itself quite an accomplishment. I'm going to introduce our special guests in a minute, but I wanted to start by providing some background on this session and then two additional sessions that we'll have during the spring semester in the program seminar. These sessions are part of the Nicholas School's renewed commitment to fostering civil discourse on complex environmental and societal issues. Duke and the Nicholas School are a microcosm of the wider universe in which we all live. And that is a world in which people increasingly get their news from sources that feed them information they agree with, a world in which people work, live, and socialize with people who agree with them, and unfortunately a world in which people increasingly villainize those who don't agree with them. Except perhaps for some Duke environmental leadership master's students, you've all grown up in a world where environmental issues are highly polarizing and politicized. But this was not always the case, and I would urge you that if we want to, or argue that if we want to make further progress on the critical environmental issues of our time, we need to relearn how to work and how to advocate with folks who may disagree with us. So one of the goals of the program era seminar is to provide training in professional skills that you might not be taught in your other classes. So today we're going to have the privilege of learning from one of the true legends in environmental and civil rights activism, the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis. Again, next semester we'll have two sessions in back-to-back weeks where you'll have a chance to get some training on bridge building and constructive and civil discourse and a chance to practice those skills with one another. These, of course, are not just skills that matter for your time at Duke, but indeed for your entire professional and personal lives. So with that background, let me turn to introduce our special guest. Lifetime activist Dr. Chavis overcame racial injustice and wrongful imprisonment to become a vocal leader in the civil rights movement, which pressed for equality between the races. Dr. Chavis is an ordained minister in the United Church of Christ. He began his career in 1963 as a statewide youth coordinator in North Carolina for the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. A native of Oxford, North Carolina, Dr. Chavis received his Bachelor of Arts, BA in chemistry from the University of North Carolina, but I think the one in Charlotte. So he wore green, not the wrong color blue. He then earned his Master's of Divinity, magna cum laude from Duke University. But importantly, he earned that while serving an unjust 34-year prison sentence as a member of the Wilmington 10, who Amnesty International declared political prisoners, a case that garnered international attention when they were pardoned 40 years later. He also received a Doctor of Ministry from Howard University and a Doctor of Philosophy and Systematic Theology from the Union Theological Seminary in New York. From 1993 and 1994, Dr. Chavis serves as the Executive Director and CEO of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, and remains an active supporter of that organization. In 1995, Dr. Chavis was the National Director and Organizer of the Million Man March. He's offered books and other publications, including An American Political Prisoner, Appeals for Human Rights, Psalms from Prison. The Reverend Dr. Chavis is widely considered the grandfather of the environmental justice movement. The initial environmental justice spark sprang from a Warren County, North Carolina protest. In 1982, a small, predominantly African-American community was designated to host a hazardous waste landfill. This landfill would accept PCB-contaminated soil that resulted from illegal dumping of toxic waste along roadways. After removing the contaminated soil, the state of North Carolina considered a number of potential sites to host the landfill, but ultimately settled on this small African-American community. In response to the state's decision, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People and others staged a massive protest. More than 500 protesters were arrested, including Dr. Chavis, from the United Church of Christ, and Delegate Walter Fauntroy. While Warren County protests failed to prevent the siting of the disposal facility, it did provide a national start to the environmental justice movement. In 1986, Dr. Chavis conducted and published the landmark national study, Toxic Waste and Race in the United States of America, that statistically revealed the correlation between race and location of toxic waste throughout the United States. Duke is thrilled that the Reverend Dr. Chavis is choosing to spend 2024 with us as the inaugural Environmental Justice and Racial Equity Fellow. We hope that this is just the beginning of a continued close relationship with Duke, but right now, please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Bennear.
Thank you very much.
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here, and just want to salute the work of the Nicholas School of the Environment. Last week I was at the University of Mississippi, Ole Miss, and I was telling them about Duke. They need to do more in Mississippi on environment, but such is the case on all of the states. So I'm glad to be here at Duke.
Well, we're thrilled to have you. So let me start by asking, as a decades-long champion of environmental justice, can you reflect on how far we've come on these issues, where we are on them today, and what role our students can play in the years ahead to promote environmental equity?
Well, thank you. Obviously, there was environmental activism before 1982. The reason why 1982 is designated the beginning of a more formal environmental justice movement is because of what happened in Warren County. It wasn't just the fact that the state of North Carolina decided to put thousands of truckloads, I think it was 10,000 truckloads of PCB, polychlorinated biphenyls, very cancer-causing, carcinogenic substance, in a predominantly rural farming community in Warren County. Of the 100 counties in North Carolina, Warren County was the most predominantly Black, and also one of the poorest counties. What was significant is that the residents of Warren County decided they were going to protest. And a lot of us joined them. And it was in that context that I coined the term environmental racism. Environmental racism is the deliberate targeting of communities of color for environmental hazards. It is the exclusion of people of color from environmental public policy making. And just to talk globally, environmental justice, injustice is just not an American phenomenon. It's all around the world. So in a lot of parts of the world where they extract minerals or extract oil, it leaves a devastating ecological and environmental impact. So I have been involved in this movement now for a considerable period of time. And I have seen, to answer your question, some change. I think back in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan was president. And he was not necessarily an advocate of the environment or the climate. And the EPA in the 1980s, the Environmental Protection Agency, did more to protect the polluters than it did to protect those who were polluted. That has changed now. In 2024, we have an Office of Environmental Justice in the EPA. And one of the young men that works in that office was on my staff, Charles Lee, who was the co-author of Toxic Waste and Race with me in 1987. So yes, has there been progress? Yes. But do we still have a long ways to go? Yes. The people in Flint, Michigan, who was by having lead pipes in the municipal water system. The thing you should know, you probably already know, master students, that once you're lead poisoned, there's no detoxification for lead poison. You live with that in real life. So while we can remediate land, remediate meadowlands, you can't remediate a human being that's been lead poison. And more recently, Jackson, Mississippi, the capital city of Mississippi, discovered that it had municipal water problems. Yet the governor refused to allow the funding from the federal government to assist predominantly Black Jackson, Mississippi. So I could point to many other examples of we need the environmental justice movement today more than we needed it in 1982. But on the other side, I would say that environmental groups, the Sierra Club, the Audubon Society, the National Wildlife Federation, the National Environmental Defense Fund, a lot of different groups. In 1982, most of those groups were not inclusive, they were exclusive. Today, the head of the Sierra Club is African American. And Greenpeace and all other groups now have a much more diverse workforce, and I see that as a plus. While there's some debate now about diversity in America, but I think diversity is a good thing. I think diversity is good for Duke. I think diversity is good for public policymakers. Quite frankly, I think diversity is good for the world in which we live in.
Great, thank you. Given your extensive experience, what is your take on the role of advocacy, particularly in these polarizing times as it relates to environmental justice and elevating the discussion of race and environmental quality?
Well, the role of advocacy is central, very important. I tell people all the time, the worst thing can be is silent, no articulation of the interests of those who are underserved or those who are unfortunate or those who consider themselves to be voiceless. So who will be the voice for the voiceless? That's where public advocates come in. To do our research. One of the reasons why we did tolerance and race in the United States, you just couldn't make an allegation about discrimination, you had to prove it statistically. You know, we live in a data conscious world. All right, so who's going to collect the data? Who's going to analyze the data? And who's going to distribute the analysis of the data in a format that's perceptible and understood by the most vulnerable in our communities, in our society. So yes, I think I live in Washington, D.C. I come to Duke every Tuesday to teach. I just taught class earlier today on global environmental justice over in the old Kim building. And I was thinking about, you know, what I was going to do coming here. Dean, I want to thank you for inviting me. I think we need more public advocates, but our public advocacy should be informed by the latest research, the latest technology, the latest science. There's this kind of anti-science syndrome going on in America, where people are not only in denial of climate change, but they're in denial of the intersection between public health and environment, the intersection between public health and climate. So I think one way to overcome this denials of science, denials of reality, is we need more stronger public advocacy. We need to raise our voices more. And raise our voices, not just in terms of protests, but raise our voices in Congress, state legislatures, municipal bodies, where policy is determined.
It's great. So one of the things I think that's striking is we do live in a data-rich world and a data-conscious world, but it's also one increasingly where, you know, with cell phones and social media, people are sort of able to pick and choose what data they hear. So how do we think about training students, or how students should go and be advocates and work with people or try to understand people who might just be like, I don't even believe that, you read that in the New York Times. The New York Times is totally biased, whatever it might be. Like, these are just such challenging times, I think, to have conversations across difference because of the way in which we isolate ourselves from people who don't think the way we do.
Thank you. I think in that one question, you asked 3 questions.
Yeah, I'm sure I did. That was off script too, so I apologize.
But they're related. So first thing I would like to say is that the media, what I would call the established media, ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox News, PBS, versus social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, etc. Then you have a lot of other media, print, digital. We have more exposure to media than ever before. The problem arises, exposure to media does not necessarily mean that one is educated on the issues. Or I would say one is informed on the issues in a manner in which they can use the information to help improve the quality of life of all people. I'm not an advocate of Fox News, but I watch Fox News because I need to see how ridiculous they are and challenge what you don't know. So that's why I watch Fox News. But on the other hand, I'm concerned that CNN and MSNBC, in my view, are trying to be like Fox because we live in a media society where impressions, audience, determines the dollar value, the monetary value of media. Media is much more monetary conscious than truth conscious. What stories are focused, what stories are highlighted. That's not all media, I'm talking, general now. My daytime job in Washington, D.C., I'm the president and CEO of the National Newspaper Publishers Association, 250 Black-owned newspapers and media companies, some print, some digital, all over the United States. We don't consider ourselves to be in the mainstream media, but we're in the media. We're sort of the alternative media. And we try to, one, do those good news stories. There's so much good news out here, but nobody knows about it. You gotta do something tragic. You gotta do something awful. You gotta do something terrible to get it. Even the people who do these hideous things or shooting up schools or even trying to shoot the president, they write out a letter because they want to become famous. That's a problem. How we seek gratification, how do we seek glorification, offer the negative. And my background is civil rights. I'm giving you a long answer to your question.
It's okay. It's a long question.
I started working with Martin Luther King Jr. when I was 14 years old. I was a youth coordinator for SCLC here in North Carolina. The reason I bring this up is because the media has changed from the 1960s to now. At one point, the media was an advocate of social justice, showing the films of video. There wasn't no social media back then, but to capture the people being hosed or tear gassed or dogs biting just because they're trying to vote. Those images went all over the world. Today, we have images, we have news, but the images in the news very little connote what is the essence of the story. The problem with social media, you get the headline, but you don't get the substance. You get a few characters, but you don't get the substance. And I think those of you who are working on your masters urge you to dig deep. Don't be a surface intellectual. Dig deep. Because if I can use that analogy, the deeper you dig into a subject matter, the more you're going to find out that what was on the surface rose to the surface, not because it's right. It rose to the surface because that's how it was promoted. And so while the second part of your question, we live in this data society, data world, but Dean, I would question who asked the questions of the data. Because you can just crunch numbers. Why we did toxic waste and race again in 1987, no one ever asked the question, is there a correlation between race and the location of these toxic waste facilities in the United States? Most people thought, well, it's because these people are poor, that's why they're dumped on. Our statistical analysis of every zip code in the United States, including Alaska and Hawaii, showed that poverty was not the major determining factor, it was race. And we proved it scientifically, statistically. The relevance of today is we need more advocates that ask the right questions. You're never going to get the right answers if you don't ask the right questions. That's what I mean by digging deep. Now, the problem with Western education versus Eastern education, I think sometimes we become so critical. We're critical of the critical of the critical of the critical. And we become the paralysis of analysis. At some point, you have to have conclusion. At some point, you have to say, based on my analysis of the data, based on the information I have, these are the findings of the research, these are the conclusions. But then you have a responsibility to interpret and to relate what you know to people who are not degreed, to communities who may not have accessibility to even the nomenclature. People in Warren County, they didn't know what polychlorinated biphenyls were. You know, PCBs, what does that mean? But they later found out that how cancer causing it was. Not because it's something they read in a book, because of their lifestyle, because there were studies done after the landfill was filled that when women in Warren County became pregnant, their milk, maternal milk, was contaminated with PCBs from drinking the well water, because eventually one other thing you need to know. The science at that time, well, some science, I think it was pseudoscience, said that these landfills would never leak. We had people from the North Carolina Environmental Department in 1986. This is the state of the art. Reverend Chavis, don't worry, we're gonna put this plastic down, and this plastic is impenetrable. Well, after several years, it leaked. It got into the well water. And several years later, the governor determined that they wanted to detoxify it on site rather than to dig it up. Now, whether the detoxification worked is still an open question, because again, there's been no systematic health study, even after all these years of Warren County.
There you go. Some master's projects just mentioned, I think. So when you first started your fellowship at Duke earlier this calendar year, you were at a similar event with Provost Gallimore asking you questions. And I distinctly remember that former Governor McCrory was in the room, and you actually said, I'm really happy that my friend Governor McCrory is here. And it really struck me. Most of you are not from North Carolina, and you're also young. But Governor McCrory was our Republican governor a couple governors ago. And before that, he had been the mayor of Charlotte, North Carolina. So you've been working in this field for a long time in the South, where there are often Republicans in power, in positions of power. Can you just give an example for our students of a situation where you had to work with people across the aisle and how you navigated that and what you learned from it?
Well, I'm a Democrat, but the fact that I'm a Democrat doesn't retard my efforts to work with Republicans. I believe in partisanship. If you look at the infrastructure bill, all the major bills that got through this current Congress, it's only because of bipartisanship. And if you look at the bills that never got through Congress because of the absence of bipartisanship. Governor McCrory we became friends. He's a very conservative Republican. I guess I'm a very liberal Democrat. But we found ways and means to work together. Even today, I'm co-chair of No Labels, which is a bipartisan group. I kind of got myself in a little hot water with my civil rights leaders. They said, "Man, why are you spending your time with these Republicans?" Well, the truth of the matter is, the environment is not partisan. Climate is not partisan. Racial and social inequities are not partisan. Not whether to the right or to the left. And I've just known in my career that you not only reach across the aisle, but you work across the aisle. You build relationships across the aisle. I'll give you an example. Louisiana is a very conservative state, red state. One of the United States senators in Louisiana is Senator Cassidy. He also happens to be a physician, one of the few physicians in the United States Senate. So Senator Cassidy and I worked together on maternal health issues because studies have shown that African American women have a high degree of mortality, maternal mortality. And that's because not only the absence of healthcare, prenatal healthcare, but it's a disproportionate exposure in Louisiana to environmental hazards. Now, a conservative Republican senator would be supportive of the petrochemical industry, which is one of the heart of Louisiana. But he decided to focus on the public health question of Black women in Louisiana and not lose his credibility as a conservative Republican. I'm just using that as an example that outreach, I would rather win people over to my side than to point people and cast them to whatever, and they never change. I think our nation is polarized today. It's about the election. I come from Granville County. It's my native about 25 miles from here. And sometimes when I'm at Duke, I drive over to Oxford, but I don't take the interstate. I want to go through the back road because I want to know what's happening. And I'll be shocked. I see all these Trump signs all over the place. And one farmer who was so in love with Trump, he took a blowtorch and put Trump's name in his barn, almost burned his barn down. So this polarization, I'm talking about political polarization, impedes collaborative work on the environment, collaborative work on climate, collaborative work on public health issues. But I've come today as somewhat of an optimist. I think the energy of the environmental movement today, the energy of climate change movement today, are young people. Studies have shown that young people today are less prejudiced than their grandparents. That's a good thing. Anybody is born a racist. I don't think anybody is born with a hate of another person because of their religion or because of their ethnicity or because of their skin color or whatever. I think these things come because of the negative socialization, the stereotypes, the myths. That's why we need education. I mean, at the heart of racism is ignorance. Ignorance. How do we overcome ignorance? You know, by having hopefully a better education, a good education. Because once you learn the truth, you know, I'm also a theologian said, truth will set you free. Well, you got to get the truth in order to be free. And unfortunately, going back to the media, we have a society where half-truths become the truth. I never heard this phrase before, alternative truth. There's no alternative to the truth. Either the truth or it's not the truth. There's no alternative truth. But that's the kind of, I think, accommodation that is made to keep people comfortable with their prejudice rather than to invite them to a more sustained comfortability with the truth.
Just going to probe a little bit further on that. I mean, so you've given a couple of examples of working with people who might disagree with you strongly on one issue, petrochemical refinery pollution in Louisiana, but where you found a commonality on another issue. So how did you how did you reach that point where you're like, okay, we're going to agree to disagree on these things, but we can work together on these common issues? And what happens if those things intersect? Like the pollution from the refineries might also be contributing to the maternal health. So how do you negotiate those boundaries?
Thank you. Well, I have to give Dr. King credit. His last book before he was assassinated was Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? So you have to choose chaos or community. We choose community. And what does that mean? I think I said it when I was interviewing with the provost. The truth is, there's only one race, and that's the human race. We're all part of one human family. A good friend of mine is a molecular biologist. I'm in public health majors in.
There's some environmental health and toxicology folks. Yay. Okay, a few. Yeah.
All right. So the latest research in molecular biology shows that, you're trying to unpack the human genome, DNA. And the latest studies show that all human beings are about 98.9% the same. So if we're all 98.9% the same, why do we let the 1%, 0.2, make us hate each other, make us discriminate against each other, make us more, in some cases, kill each other? Something wrong with that. And I think we live in a world that has been socialized and politicized, where we always have to create who's the enemy. And I think that's a problem. So to answer your question, Dean, I feel that community is something you have to work on. Collaborations is something you have to work on. And I've found the strongest community, the strongest collaboration is sometimes with people who may disagree with you on some issue, but find a common ground on other issues. So the question is, how do you find that common ground? Well, you never find it by not having a discussion. I work and live in Washington, D.C. I'm very often have a breakfast or dinner or lunch with people who are diametrically opposed to my position on some issues. But just in the exchange, You find a way to communicate. And to me, if you become a public advocate or if you become a science advocate, it is not only what we communicate, but it's how we communicate it and what are the consequences of our communication.
Great, that's terrific. So one of the other priorities I have for this discussion over the course of the year, not just on in learning skills that help us do exactly that, engage with people who might disagree with us on some issues and find those commonalities, learn to understand their point of view, even if we continue to disagree with it. But the other is to help us all build a little bit more resilience. We've seen, particularly since COVID, a decline in sort of in resiliency in general for folks, particularly younger folks. You've overcome a lot in your life. I mean, you were wrongfully imprisoned for 35 years, 40 years?
I had a 34 years.
34-year sentence?
I didn't serve 34 years.
Okay. But there was a great story about how they picked you up at the jail in the morning in the van and dropped you off in front of the chapel, and then you could take your classes during the day to get your divinity degree, and then you'd get back in the van and go back to jail at night. You have overcome so many things. So what do you attribute your own personal resilience to? And if you had advice you could offer students on how to, we work on hard things and sometimes there's setbacks, right? How do you face those setbacks and then continue to move forward?
Wow. I mean, I could give you an hour answer to this question. I'll try to be succinct. During the Civil Rights Movement, we sing a song, "We Shall Overcome." Some of you may have heard of it. Malcolm sing "We Shall Overcome." We were singing the song, but we were not overcoming. But we sang the song anyway as a projection. You know, you never have hope if you lose hope. So it was important for us to engender not only a sense of resilience, but a sense of the value of life itself, the value of all life. And so I grew up in the Civil Rights Movement with that kind of ethic, social ethic, of the equality of all people, and therefore the necessity to challenge the various inequalities that were being institutionalized, whether in the courts or politics or economics. You used the term resilience. I think that's right, but I would say that each generation has to rise to the occasion. You learn from what the history has been, what the legacy. But for example, all of you today are exposed to more information than any other generation in the world. You're exposed to the latest technology. The question is, how do you use this information? How do you use AI? How do you use technology? To what end? My encouragement to you is that you should learn from history. You don't have to repeat it. But the question is, how can I contribute? How can my master's degree contribute to making the world a better place? And some of you say, oh, that sounds like you want to be a do-gooder. No. Because if you help make the world a better place, you help make yourself a better person. And that's one of the reasons why we have education like at Duke. We come in with what we have and leave, hopefully, with what we've gained, what we've been able to retain. When I was unjustly incarcerated, I don't know if I mentioned to this thing, it wasn't just like I decided to walk into Duke. I had been in a master's program at Howard University before my incarceration. So my position was, I had an unjust 34-year prison. I said, I'm not going to serve time. I'm going to serve humanity. So I became an organizer in prison. And of course, the prison authorities were aware of it. So they started moving me around to different prisons, which I think they also made a mistake. Because the more they moved around, the more prisons I could talk to. And, you know, so it came a point where they put on my prison jacket. Everybody has a folder, a jacket. And some of the black prison guards said, hey man, you see what they put in your jacket? I said, Chavis should be incarcerated in a prison where blacks are a minority. That's a hard prison to find in North Carolina. There was only one such prison, and that was the McCain Prison Sanatorium in McCain, North Carolina. Sanatorium had 3 cell blocks. One for geriatric, you had to be over 90 years old. Obviously, I wasn't 90. I was 23, 24. They had a tuberculosis ward, and they had a behavioral modification ward. So I was trying to say, man, I wonder what ward are they gonna put me in? He put me in the tuberculosis ward. I didn't have tuberculosis, but you know, you have to overcome certain things and not let that deter your humanity. You know, if you are treated inhumane, the last thing you want to do is treat somebody else inhumane. You know, at least, and that's my view. So I wrote a letter to Terry Sanford, who was the president of Duke at the time. I knew him when he was United States Senator. And I said, I would like to transfer my credits from Howard University to Duke in the Master's of Divinity program. And I would like to get accepted from Duke first, and then I'll put a leverage on the prison system to allow me to attend. That's exactly what happened. That's what my credits. Duke accepted me. The first time Duke has accepted someone out of prison for a master's program. And it was a little difficult getting the prison system to, but the prison I was in McCain, they were so glad for me to leave. They said, well, no, send him to Hillsborough. And that's how I went to Hillsborough. And from Hillsborough prison every day, they would pick me up in this van, handcuff me. They used to put chains to my ankles, but they stopped doing that after a while because it didn't make sense. Because I used to tell them, I said, what if we have an accident? You got me chained up like this. So they would bring me in front of Duke Chapel. And at that time, you could just drive up to the front of Duke, get out, go to class. 5 o'clock, they'll pick me up, go back to prison. Now, this degree at Duke is not easy. In divinity, I had to learn Greek and Hebrew. So I had to learn the Greek language, which is a different alphabet, over the summer. And in the prison, lights out at 10. There's only one place where there was a light. That's in the prison bathroom, which is not the most rewarding place. But that's where I did my studies. I became a very serious student because I knew that I was setting an example for others. You know, if this experiment of me being in prison going to do work, and other inmates could have that opportunity. So yeah, was I going for myself? Yes. Was I going for my family? Yes. Was I going for the civil rights movement? Yes. But I was also going for others. I have found out in my life, if you do for others, it's like karma. What you do for others will come back in different ways. And that has been my life journey.
It's fantastic. It's a truly inspiring story. The questions are starting to roll in here on the Slido. So if you haven't asked your question, use the QR code. You guys have definitely figured out the like function. So not surprisingly. Thanks for helping me in my moderator duties. They're all coming in anonymous, which I guess is fine. As we see a decline in third spaces, including church membership, where do you see the future of community hubs for the environmental justice campaigns?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Question is, why is there a decline in churches? Why is there a decline in other places where people gather for faith or for some kind of social action? Why is there a rise in alienation in some communities? Why is this almost tendency to look backwards and really want to go backwards? It's okay to look backwards, you can learn something to go forward. But there's a tendency now in America, I want to go back to the good old days. What were the good old days? You know? And I think that that becomes problematic when you're trying to organize an environmental movement or a climate justice movement. But ironically, COVID exposed all the pre-existing conditions. And most of the pre-existing conditions were environmentally impacted. So now there are more studies about the intersection between public health and environment and climate than ever before, post-COVID. And I think it's kind of sad that it took a tragedy, took a pandemic, over 1 million people lose their lives, for us to become a much more conscious society about the relationship with health and environment, but also a more caring society to care for others who are less fortunate. In my view, it shouldn't take a tragedy for us to come together. That's about community. And unfortunately, I think the reason why churches are on a decline, because they are somewhat aloof to what is going on in the communities around the church. A church is not a building. A church is a community of faith. And the extent to which the community of faith isolates itself from the very community where it's situated, then you're gonna have decline. Now, in some cities, it's gentrification, because a lot of indigenous residents in a lot of these places can't afford to live in these centers, so they go out, and then the churches become vacant. So there are a number of things, but I would say, you know, I'm a former vice president of the National Council of Churches. So I got a sort of a panoramic view of all the Protestant denominations. And this is in the 1980s. I think there was a good deal more cooperation, ecumenical, interfaith dialogue. I think we need to restore that, work on that more. But also I think the young people are sort of demanding that our institutions, religious institutions, education institutions, become much more relevant to what they're experiencing today. And I think those institutions that are connected to the relevance of young people's mindset thinking, they will grow. Others will decline. I am hopeful and optimistic about the youth of today. I think the young people today are the most gifted, most talented, smartest generation of young people who've ever been witnessed. The problem is, though, so much discourages our young people rather than encourage. And that is why a lot of the people who have the potential to rise don't rise, because they've been discouraged into these kind of silos of hopelessness. And our job is to encourage people, not only to overcome, but encourage people to be their best. Encourage people to find their best within and without.
Great. Okay. We keep things keep moving around as people like more things. It's a little confusing. Methods that are productive for countering disinformation when communicating with those of differing views.
That's another very good question. I think that it used to be we live in the age of information. Now let's say we live in the age of disinformation. We live in the age of misinformation. So where do you find information? Where do you find the truth? That's why the academy, that is why graduate schools and undergraduate, but particularly graduate schools, you not only have the opportunity, but I would say some responsibility to counter the misinformation and disinformation. But I would say, I would not get to the place where my truth is better than your truth. No, I don't own the truth. You don't own the truth. The truth owns itself. And that's what we should try to work toward. Letting truth be the goal, and the objectives to reach that truth should open ourselves to exploration of getting the truth from as many diverse places and sources as possible. Because to me, a narrow quest to gain the truth, to seek the truth, to articulate the truth, I think being narrow limits one's capacity to ever find it. Broader, I think you have a great opportunity not only to find the truth, but to associate that truth with other truths to help improve our society.
Yeah, that's great. I'm just going to follow up a little. Like, one of the things that I have found personally since the Trump election, the last one, where he won, is that I tend to be a person who, when I'm confronted with somebody who has an opposing view, or I think that they're just wrong, I want to point out to them all the ways in which they're wrong, because like I've studied this and like I know this is why you're wrong. And that just tends not to work very well. And now I've tried to teach myself to lean in more with curiosity and say, so tell me a little bit about why you think that. Doesn't always work, but I'm just curious if you've had any experience like past the need to like win to create space where you can communicate more.
Well, I think the context of the communication is important. Yes, if you go to somebody and start pointing out all their wrongs, they're gonna firm up. So rather than pointing about what's wrong with the other, you have to say what's right with what your perspectives are. I would spend more time saying why I believe my truth is applicable to your situation, and do it in a way where you're trying to help the person, not trying to demean the person, not trying to put down the person. I think a lot of times in debates, believe that I have to slay who I'm debating, or else it's not a good debate. I think that if we have a discussion, even when we disagree, at the end of the discussion, we ought to be able to work together, if that's your goal. And I think a lot of times, politicians today, if I could say that, are impacted by not just winning, but I would say conquering the other. And I think that's engenders bad politics. I'm looking for those things that transform communities, transform people, transform nations. I think there are a lot of serious problems going on in the world in which we live. I think the United States could be much more creative. I don't think everything has a military solution. Yes, should we have a strong military? Yes. I'm not anti-military. I just don't think that having a strong military is the only deterrent to fascism or to, going back. I never thought, well, I'm going to say this. I cannot believe that this guy is running for governor in North Carolina, call himself a black Nazi. I don't even see how he could attach those two words. But that's the predicament that we're in. Cuts across race, cuts across ethnicity. So, and the question is, why would North Carolinians even consider voting for somebody like that? And that's because the politics has become so polarized. The Republicans are more interested in winning than determine what is it they win with, or what is it they win for. I think that eventually that kind of politics is going to be rejected. I think that what happened in Georgia was a great example. Georgia is a very deep red state, but it sent 2 progressive members to the United States Senate, 1 Jewish, 1 black. So, I think that the reason why I'm encouraged, because I look for things that encourage me. Now, if you spend your time looking for things that depress you, I assure you, you will be depressed. So you have to wake up in the morning, go to sleep at night, say your prayers, and then determine that you're going to not just do good that day, the next day, but be of good. And I'm not trying to get you to be puritanical. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying, though, there's some very seductive things that go on in our society that will make one want to engage in something very, very negative, very, very controversial, just to get attention. I'm very concerned about that. I see people want to get attention for doing something transformative, help people, rather than to do something like take somebody's life because I want to be famous. That is so counter to what the word humanity means.
We've had several here that kind of have a similar theme, so I'm going to kind of repackage them a little bit, but
Okay.
it's essentially around common ground with people, or do you have to find common ground with people who disregard your humanity due to factors such as race, gender, personal decisions? And then also related to that, you're trying to work through differences with people, but run the danger of unintentionally platforming or amplifying those viewpoints and putting people in harm's way.
Well, those are 2 good questions. One, I would say that when I have a discussion with people who I know already disagree with me, I'm not trying to win an argument. I'm trying to have a conversation. I think that we do need more bipartisan dialogue, nonpartisan work. At the very individual level, I think that learn how to communicate. That's why I think speaking more than English is important. I travel around the world. People know 4 or 5 different languages. I feel so inept because I don't know how to speak English. And why am I bringing that up? Is because we live in a global world where English may be the language of choice, the language of the economy. But I think in the ability to communicate with people in another language also sets a bridge where the dialogue can be much more constructive. I think dialogue can also be destructive if it comes out the wrong way. And then lastly, I think that if you have principles that you live by, then you can have the dialogue, and then have the dialogue won't drift you away from your principles. I would encourage all of you, if you haven't read, you should read the 17 Principles of Environmental Justice. The first people of color Environmental Leadership Summit had in 1991 in Washington, D.C. It took us 3 or 4 days to come up with those principles. And they still apply. So I use a lot of those principles to kind of guide me, even when I have dialogue. I got a cold reverberation of those principles. So if you're going to have a dialogue or even debate, make sure you go into the dialogue debate with your own set of principles. If not, then you will get lured off course, and you will wind up amplifying even your opponent's point of view.
Very interesting. Many people discuss the civil rights movement in the past tense. As a leader at that time, did you feel a sense of completion or transition? Has that changed over time?
Yes. I don't see the movement as being conclusive. I see the movement as being evolutionary. We evolve. In 2024, we need a civil rights movement, just like we needed in 1964 or 1963. The question is, what can we learn from that past, from those prior movements, those prior struggles, those prior victories, actually? The Civil Rights Bill of 1964 was only made possible because of Senator Everett Dirksen, who was a Republican, joined with President Johnson, who was a Democrat, to get the Civil Rights Bill passed through the Congress. That set the stage in 1965 for the Voting Rights Act. That set the stage in 1968 for the Fair Housing Act, and on and on and on. So each movement makes its contribution, but it moves on. I don't see a distinction, a clear distinction between, I see the relationship between these movements. You may be surprised. That's why I'm an advocate of hip hop, because I see hip hop as being a movement of young people who self-express themselves in non-traditional ways. To me, the best expression in life is self-expression. A lot of people feel that their opportunity to self-express themselves is taken away from them. That's why I encourage people to write. And I don't encourage people to read, but I encourage people to write. Because your writing is not only a culmination of what you've learned, but it's also how you express what you've learned. And I think writing is very important, particularly if you want to go into the sphere of public advocacy.
Okay, we'll keep a few more questions here. I know that some of you might have to leave here in about 5 minutes, and so I'm just letting you know that's okay, and reminding you that they're not walking out on you because. Do you have any advice for someone who is white who wants to support or lead in the environmental justice movement?
Sure. Again, my definition of environmental justice is open to all people. It's not whether you're white or whether you're black or whether you're Latino or whether you're Arab American or Jewish American. We all have to work together. But I would say, particularly for white American students, since you come from predominant culture and influence, thank you. Very talented, thank you.
Sandra.
Excuse me for being low. I've been speaking a lot today. there's not only a place for white Americans in the environmental justice movement, but I would say there's a place for leadership. It's a problem if only Black people speak out against racism. It's a problem if only Jewish people speak out against. It's a problem if only Arab communities speak out against Islamophobia. It's a problem if only people in the LGBTQ community speak out on that issue. So I think that particularly white students today, not that white students back in the 60s were not, you have to remind you that the civil rights movement was led by students. Martin Luther King Jr. himself was a young graduate student from Boston University in his 20s. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee was integrated. Northeast went south to try to get voting rights. Together, change is much more accelerated. Divided, I think change is retarded. So I believe, as I said, I don't know if I've said it here, but I repeat myself sometimes. There's only one race, and it's the human race. I advocate that. Sometimes I ran into a lot of controversy by saying, well, man, does that mean that you and the member of the Ku Klux Klan are part of the same family? Yes. But it doesn't mean that I agree with the Ku Klux Klan. But I don't want to take away the humanity. I don't think we should try to take away the humanity of anybody. We disagree. But we should not get to the point where we start value on one human's life over the value of another human's life. I have to give you a copy. I just wrote a book on the transatlantic slave trade. And while there's a lot of focus on 1619, actually 100 years before 1619, transatlantic slave trade was going on in other parts of the world. My motive for writing this book is not just to point fingers at Europe or America, but it is to give a deeper quantification until by digging deep. I don't think people understand, even today, the magnitude of the transatlantic slave trade. The United Nations says that there's 10 to 12 million people died as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. But they start counting once you own the boat. Those who didn't make it and those who came. And there were millions more who never made it to the boat. So our research shows that for several centuries, upwards of 60 million people died as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. I think that not understanding that magnitude gives people the opportunity to trivialize what happened. Like the governor of Florida saying that slavery was beneficial because it taught people how to be carpenters, and it's not true. That's one of the situations. Of course, Florida is a state that is trying to ban books. I'm sure my book is going to be banned, which I think is good. That means people. So, and yeah, is there a place for white people? Yes, absolutely. We can't have a movement without white people. We can't have a movement without all people. And That's sort of been my life. Time does not permit. But while I was in prison, I not only helped Black inmates, I helped white inmates. I taught GED course. I wanted them to get their high school diplomas. And I didn't discriminate. I didn't say, no, I want to get everybody to get their high school diploma. Talked a lot about the reading program. There were a lot of brothers and sisters, a lot of brothers who could not read. Teach people how to read. So, you know, you do what you can do wherever you find yourself. I'll stop there.
All right. So we've got students all interested in environmental management or forestry. Some of them might be focusing on community engagement and environmental justice with the hopes of actually going out and having a job, sort of in a more obviously advocacy-facing role. But some of them are studying environmental analytics and modeling and energy systems, and they're going to go work for companies where their day-to-day job is not going to be about advocacy per se. So the question is, how can we incorporate environmental advocacy in our daily lives, especially if our profession does not explicitly offer opportunities to discuss it?
I think that what career track you're in, I think you want to be articulate and versed, certainly on your own career, but the intersections of your career with environment, with climate. Over the last 20 or 30 years, there's much more discussions in the C-suite, as well as other parts of major corporations about environmental justice. So whether or not it's a part of your career track, I understand the question, but I would encourage everyone, no matter what your career goal is, to lend some time and effort and energy toward making a contribution to the environmental justice movement or to the climate justice movement. Because these issues are going to become more and more acute over the years to come. I think we're going to wind up having climate crisis, we're going to have environmental crisis, and the extent to which we are more prepared for those crisis moments is the extent to which we can be able to not just survive them, but learn from them and try to prevent further crises in the environment and climate.
So I think I'm going to ask one more from the list because I know you're teaching a class this semester called Global Environmental Justice. And so one of the questions is that environmental justice is a global issue and will need most countries' total support. So how do we emphasize or use our domestic efforts to create change across the world? Small question, you got it, no problem.
A fact, American foreign policy is informed by its domestic policy. Secondly, there is a global environmental movement that has emerged among young people. There's a global climate justice movement that has emerged. Question is, how do these movements work? While we're here tonight, there are leaders from all over the world in New York at the United Nations. Around the General Assembly of the United Nations, there are all kinds of conferences in New York right now on the environment, on climate week, climate month, which I think is very healthy. President Clinton has an initiative. President Obama has an initiative. I think that way to connect this globality, global reality of the environment and climate is to make connections. Right now, in my class that I teach, I'm going to have young people from Brazil come and talk about global environmental justice in Brazil. We should use technology. You know, we can hear from other parts of the world on these issues by using technology. I think that's very healthy. I think the more we understand the diversity of opinions, the diversity of public policies, I think all this enables us to be more effective, be more efficient. Last thing I would like to say is that I think the academy environmental justice, we need more books on climate justice. We need more master's theses on this subject. We need more PhD dissertations on this subject. And then we can get that material published and distributed. I not only lecture from time to time at colleges, but I spent some time in high schools, junior high schools. And I'm always amazed that young people are hungry and thirsty for information. They just don't know where to go get it. You know, I mean, substantive information on these subjects. A lot of young people today worry about, you know, is the world going to be livable in 50 years? Worry about, are we going to have enough clean water for everybody to drink because the population is growing? I think that rather than have young people worry, I think we should have young people inspired not to wait for the future, but help shape the future. You know, I think when discussions of the future, when you write, when you publish, it should be toward the end of helping to shape something that's better, not just reflect, not just to be critique, but as a result of critique, what can we shape together to make the world a better place?
So I think we'll start to wrap up, but I just want to build off that shape. It can feel really overwhelming, the work that you all are choosing to engage in and to spend your career working on. So I just want to share something that happened over the summer at the school while you were all off doing something else. One of our faculty members, Dr. Joel Meyer, sent an all faculty email asking for examples of success stories in the environmental movement because he wanted to talk about it with the new PhD students coming in because he thought, quote, I think they need a pep talk. And for 3 weeks, emails just flooded in from faculty all across the school with examples of environmental success stories over the last 30, 40, 50 years. And normally we hate those reply all things to listservs, right? It's awful. Well, maybe you guys don't because you're all in group chat all the time, but people my age hate it. But this was literally one of the most joyful and inspiring reply all listserv things that I've ever been a part of. And it reminds us that, my football analogy, you know, you just got to keep moving the ball down the field. And sometimes we lose sight of that. So I'll end with one more sports analogy. That's a Duke. I'll bring it back to Duke here. Last spring at my commencement speech for the students, I talked about Coach Carl Lawson. She's the women's basketball coach. She has a statement that says, handle hard better. And the story is, you know, we all keep thinking, if I just get through this, like life will be easier. If I just get through this final exam, then it's going to be easier. And life doesn't get easier. You just learn to handle hard better. But I'm going to modify this now. And my goal will not be just to handle hard better, but I'd like to be able to handle hard maybe 25% as well as the Reverend Dr. Benjamin Chavis. So I want to thank you for joining us this evening and sharing your wisdom with all of our students. And we're going to have a reception out in the foyer here, which you're welcome to stay. And let's just join me in giving the Reverend Dr.